Welcome, everybody. We're glad that you're here with us on the second of the Saturate webinars on politics. And so I'm Chris Gonzalez. I pastor a church here in Tempe, Arizona that we planted about 12 years ago. And then also help lead the Missional Training Center and do some stuff with the Surge Network here in Phoenix. And so want to just take a couple minutes. Basically, the way this is going to go for the next hour or next 57 minutes is I want to set up briefly and just kind of frame for us, for a Saturate kind of crowd, why this is so important and what we're going to be talking about today. And then I'm just going to turn it over to Mike. He's got a slide presentation. We'll work through some stuff. And then we will take some time for Q&A as well. So there should be in the bottom of your screen both a chat feature, which you can feel free to chat and talk about different things, but a Q&A feature as well. So ask questions there, and while Mike's talking, and I will be looking at those. I don't suppose we might not be able to get to all of them in the time frame that we have, but we'll try to get to as many as we can and work through some of the question and answer. I want to be helpful there. So like I said, we planted our church about 12 years ago, and for myself and Kevin Platt, who we planted the church together, and then there were a number of other pastors here in our city who were all at the time, everybody's talking about missional, and we wanted to be missional, but a lot of it was kind of reactive and pretty shallow, like just different ways of kind of trying to do different kinds of church services, or going and feeding homeless people, adding some different things on. And in the midst of it, we read a book called The Drama of Scripture that Mike wrote. He was a professor up in Vancouver, Washington. Sorry, not Vancouver, in Vancouver, Canada. And so he's a professor there. We read this book, Drama of Scripture, and it just did something different. It was talking about the missional church, missional theology, but it was doing it in a way that was so much deeper. And so, long story short, we called him at his office up in Vancouver and said, "Where are you getting this from? What is this? How do we get more of this?" And had a great conversation with him. Mike came down for a couple days and just started what became a relationship of him really serving and training the pastors in the church here in Phoenix, Arizona over the last dozen years. And so he's really shaped a lot of how we're asking questions, not just like, how do we grow our churches or how do we be good churches, wherever, but really fundamentally asking the question, how do we be a faithful presence and a faithful witness to the kingdom here in our city? So to use saturate language, how do we saturate our city in all the different aspects of our city with a witness to a holistic witness to the gospel that's faithful to answer the questions that are increasingly diverse and increasingly very quickly changing culture was bringing at us. And so Mike has been really helpful in helping us think through a lot of that. And so what you're going to get today is just a little kind of an intro foray into that, into how do we think in light of the biblical story in terms of politics. And the second thing I want to say is, this is for us as leaders here in Phoenix and the churches and Surge Network. This has been really important, and this has been on our radar for the last year, basically because in 2016, during the last national presidential elections, when things were going on with racism, as they are now, in a conversation, and more than a conversation with that in the election, it became basically as pastors, we all realized about a year ago, we didn't do very well in 2016. In whole, the church in Phoenix and our local churches, we feel like we didn't lead people very well, and we weren't a faithful witness to the kingdom in the midst of it. The same division that was in our culture, in our city, was often in our churches as well. And so we've been wanting to think well and to intentionally train people over the last year in some really specific ways how to engage in politics as we approach this election season. Now, all of our plans, obviously, because of coronavirus and everything else, has been thrown off, but still wanting to be faithful in doing that. And so what we're going to talk about here is a little piece of what we've been trying to do here in Phoenix. Want to bring this to the greater Saturate and Soma family as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike. He is the professor of missional theology at Professor of Mission at Covenant Seminary in St. Louis. which is who we are partnered with here in Phoenix. We have something called the Missional Training Center, where we have a partnership with Covenant Seminary, where we do local theological education. And Mike is the director of theological education here with us at Missional Training Center here in Phoenix. But right now is back up in Vancouver with Marnie, his wife, and their kids and grandkids, and enjoying not being here in the heat of coronavirus here in Phoenix for the summer. So with that, Mike, I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. This is not a topic I normally talk about. I think I've probably talked about this topic 2 or 3 times in my entire life. But I'm talking about it in response to Chris's question to me, would I address this? And I'm addressing it as a Canadian. I'm a dual citizen and I live in both countries, but consider myself in many ways a Canadian. That's where I've spent the majority of my time. And in protesting that I should do this because I'm a Canadian, Chris's response was basically, well, as a Canadian, you're an outsider and can see things that Americans can't see because they're swimming in it. And I think that's true. And also because we've had many conversations at MTC in Phoenix about these issues, trying to help pastors think about what it means to lead their congregations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here quickly here. And I'm going to, this is going to be very, very quick in a sense, because what can you do in a half hour? And probably almost every single point here would be debatable. Every single point could be several hours of lecturing, I guarantee you that. But what we'll do is sketch a picture, and then maybe we'll have some good questions. So I'm going to address the whole issue of political ideologies. Before I start, I'm just going to suggest to you 2 books if you want to follow this up. The one on the left by Jim Skillen is one of the best books that you'll find as an introduction on the role of politics in God's creation. Jim Skillen has had a big effect on Tyler Johnson in Phoenix and has been there a number of times to speak to churches. I don't think there's a better political mind out there than Jim Skillen, and he communicates well. The second one is one of his own students who's my age. So he's the best book on political ideologies. He's an American that is taught in Canada for much of his life. You'll see that he has a good understanding of political ideologies and how they work in the North American scene. So I'll leave you those if you want to follow up on what I'm going to talk about. Let me start with just a few biblical starting points. Each one of these things could be expanded, but I'm going to again move fairly briefly, fairly quickly. The first is that government has been instituted by God for the good of human life and must conform to God's creational design. There's a lot in there. Maybe you don't find some of it controversial, but it's suggesting also that government is something that would have been part of creation before the fall. There's not complete agreement on that. And that it is something that has been created in such a way that it must conform to the way God has designed government to be. In fact, in 1 Peter, political authorities call it katesis. And if you know your Greek, you know that the word katesis is the word for creation, that it is something that God has created and must conform to God's creational design. Its specific role, and again, this took me a while to fully get this into my head, what this was meaning, but its role, its particular task in human society is to maintain public justice. The word public is important there, public justice in society. And what's meant by public justice briefly is that its task is to allow and to make sure that all entities under its geographical location all entities, individuals, institutions, groups, and including aspects of the non-human creation, are to have room to exist as God intended. In other words, to prohibit from injustice, that is impinging on what they are meant to be in God's creation. Now, right off the bat here, as I'm going to now mention ideology, I think we need to say that, especially in the American system of government, more than any other, even more than other European and Canadian system, is that what has been called 19th century liberalism, which has reduced often the government's role to protecting the role of individuals as over against institutions, groups, the non-human creation. And that liberalism dominates both the Democratic and the Republican Party and American politics in general. And so often many of the problems come because it's reduced public justice only to rights of individuals, excluding more broadly institutions, groups, and the non-human creation. Thirdly, political visions that shape all governments will, I believe, necessarily be corrupted to some degree by various idolatries and ideologies. I'll talk about what those are in a minute, so that all governments, to some degree, their political vision for what they should be doing is going to be corrupted to some degree by idolatry and ideologies. And so, and this is in many ways the bottom line where I'll come back to for churches in this time of tremendous disagreement and fighting among, and culture wars in the United States, that Christians can never give uncritical allegiance to any government, to any ideology, to any political vision, since their first loyalty is to the person of Jesus Christ. So these are just some they're simple, but they're actually full and profound, if we could open them up, some biblical starting points. Now, what is meant by ideology? There's a lot of discussion by ideology, believer and unbelievers, and won't go into that. But I want to just give a few characteristics of political ideologies. First, they are reductionistic. What I mean by that is that it's a political vision that will interpret the political task and the breadth of the political task through one aspect of that task. In other words, it will reduce the breadth of the political vision to one dimension of that task. Secondly, it has a religious dimension because human beings are religious. They will always serve someone and something. They will all be shaped by some bigger story. And these political visions are part of the bigger idolatrous cultural story that gives religious meaning to life. That is really worth keeping in mind as we reflect on politics, that they're part of a bigger idolatrous story that gives religious meaning to life. David Koyzis, in his second version of his book, I think I'm very thankful for this, has suggested that from a Christian standpoint, ideologies are in fact redemptive narratives. And what he means by that is that as they participate in this bigger cultural story, they will suggest that what they do is they say, if we follow this path politically, what we can do is build the better world we're trying to build. It's going to offer a clue how government can create this better world. And in fact, it will look to government to some degree and the ideology that government espouses as the way on to this better world. Furthermore, it is prescriptive, that the government seeks to mold society according to its vision. So this is not just philosophical. It's not just in the head. It actually will seek to mold society and it will have an impact. And finally, every ideology is inherently unjust. That is, as it will suppress other equally important aspects of the political task. And as in a moment, I'm going to use an illustration by Al Walters that when we try to suppress some dimension of the creation, it's like pressing down a tightly coiled spring. And very quickly, that tightly coiled spring will come springing back. And so as you try to suppress other dimensions of the political task, there will always be reactions and protests and response to the injustice of a particular political ideology. Now, two further comments to speak more positively here about ideologies is that first, ideologies are unable to entirely mold life according to their vision. And I say that's a good thing. Thankfully, that's the case. That God will not allow that kind of reductionist idolatry to totally destroy his creation. He upholds his creation, and he will not allow any political entity to completely devolve into a completely demonic chaos where there is really a single idolatrous vision that suppresses every other dimension of creation. He will not allow that, and he upholds his creation. And there's always going to be dimensions of public justice that are being suppressed that are going to be arising in various ways. But this is why there are often reactions and protests against reductionist political visions, because things that are being suppressed, God will not allow these dimensions of creation to be suppressed. And so what happens is very often, as the political ideology narrows to one dimension, what will happen is other dimensions that are being suppressed will protest, and there'll be reactions, and it will call forth further ideologies that take those suppressed dimensions and aspects of public justice and make them the center of a political vision. So it's much more complex than simply ideology shaping a society. But then, secondly, each ideology has much to teach us about political life. Every ideology has some creational insight into political life. So every single ideology, as it focuses on an aspect of political life, will have to some degree insight into what into the task of government and what it means to live in a political society together. And this becomes the basis for Christian involvement. In other words, acknowledging that there's always insight in every particular political ideology and trying to seize that insight and trying to make it fuller, more just, more humane, etc. Now, some general comments about American political ideologies. All of them, and there's more than two really, but I'm going to talk about four in a moment, and there's really more than four. But in any case, all of these ideologies are part of a bigger humanist story, the story and the way the U.S. has picked up on that humanist story, and a story that is increasingly becoming a global economic story. Really, that's where we have to focus for a long time if we were to do this justice and say, okay, here's the much bigger story of global humanism, economic humanism. This is how America fits into that story. And this is how the particular political ideology fits and plays its role in that story. And so that means that all ideologies, that is, we'll talk about, you want to talk about Republican and Democrat, will share together fundamental religious beliefs about the world. That's what I've heard from people outside of the United States, especially people from countries that are don't share the Western vision of life as quickly. What they'll say is that American politics often don't realize that really they're only about that far apart, that they share 95% of the fundamental religious beliefs about the world, and the 5% that they're arguing about is best how to implement that vision. If we had time, we would show, and this is what I was going to do until I realized I only had half an hour, we would show how all of these arise at different points in the Western story. And so because they arise at different points, they emphasize different political goals within that humanist vision. But they differ in various ways, in many ways actually, on what is needed for the humanist story to succeed. But each of them has a certain kind of redemptive vision as it considers what will enable this humanist story to succeed. But all of them have insight into what good politics should look like, but are dangerously reductionistic. What I want to do now is I want to share with you a diagram. And I don't take credit for this diagram. In fact, this diagram, maybe, Chris, you can tell us, I think it comes from Jim Mullins. And I think, Chris, you might have had a role in putting this diagram together. Is that right? And so this diagram is not mine. I'm borrowing it, but I find it helpful. And I'm changing a couple words that I would change. But this is a diagram that's being used in Phoenix by pastors to try to help the churches understand the notion of political ideology. In other words, they're trying to help people that maybe don't have any kind of theological or philosophical education, who have not had a theological education at MTC and reflected on the Western story and so forth, and putting a diagram together that would help them understand what political ideologies are and how they work. They start with what is typical, the spectrum of the left and the right. And we could, if we had time, we could stop and show that left-right spectrum is rooted in a 19th century ideology and idolatry, but we haven't got time. And that left and right spectrum, of course, the Democratic and the Republican Party. And they suggest that sort of a classical kind of right-wing republicanism emphasizes especially freedom. That is, especially freedom of the individual. Now, Jim and maybe others there, as they deal with, they want to emphasize responsibility as the main thing. But that this ideology is built around responsibility, taking responsibility for economic life, etc. I would suggest freedom is the central aspect, the individual freedom. They are most consistent with individual freedom. And then on the left,
Mike, to put those together, I think there's an assumption in when we say responsibility, that, and this is where this is helpful, there's an assumption that people have everybody has the freedom to make good, responsible decisions. And if everybody would just take their responsibility, because it's assumed everybody's got freedom to do that,
yes,
then everything will be better.
Yes.
That's helpful.
I appreciate that. That's sort of represented by people like the Bushes, and perhaps most consistently ideological was somebody like Ronald Reagan. On the left side, there's a concern for equality or social justice. And what we saw in the 19th century rise is that as more and more freedom was given to the economy, and the individual freedom given to people within the economy and keeping a market free, what began to become very clear very quickly is that the strong benefited from this, and the government had to put some kind of regulation on this, but to keep, so that there might be more equality and a degree of social justice. And that's been the dynamic for 100 years within politics. And everybody recognizes there has to be some freedom of the market, and everybody has to recognize there's got to be some controls on that for there to be equality. The only question is how much. And that's the discussion that has driven so much of politics. Equality, protecting the weak, and various social justice issues. And that's represented perhaps by the Clintons. Now, that's normally how we've considered it. But what I really appreciate about this particular diagram is that they introduce a new axis. And I think this is very helpful and very true and explains some really interesting things about politics today. And the axis is basically the modern, postmodern axis. The modern axis, that is the Enlightenment story that science and technology will build this better rational world of freedom and prosperity. And then the postmodern response is the story is not working and a rejection of all the dimensions of that story. And what we see in this is a new way of being both democratic and Republican. We see diversity as becoming the dominant ideology of the left, people like AOC. And what we see in people like Trump is a new concern for national security. Um, Trump often appealing to those who are losing some of their power within culture because of this new political correctness that is coming from emphasizing the ideology of diversity. But at the same time, globalization is taking more and more economic power away from the United States. And therefore, there's a concern to protect the borders and protect national security, and especially economics of national security. Now, this is way too simple, but I think if we had time to nuance it, that we'd see that there's a lot of insight into this. But here's the main point, however you might draw the map. The point is that each of these parties is emphasizing something, and that they're building a political vision around it. And if you follow that vision, we will have this better world. If you follow that vision of freedom of the individual and freedom of the market, or if you follow the vision of really being concerned for a certain degree of economic equality, or if you follow a vision for just allowing all the suppressed voices of the last 200 years to finally be able to be heard, or if you follow a vision of protecting the borders economically and politically from outside America first, make America great again. If you follow these things, then you'll make America great again. So in many ways, every one of these parties could have a MAGA hat with a different color. Let's make America great again. And so if you follow this particular vision, but the point is that each of them are stressing something important. And I've heard Jim do this. I haven't heard Chris do it, but I've heard Jim spell this out. And he'll ask the question, which of those things is important for a political vision in the United States? Is freedom important? Yes. Equality and social justice? Yes. Diversity? Yes. National security? Yes. In other words, all of them have some insight into what the political world should look like in the United States. And then their move, and I think this is a helpful move, is to stress this fact, that what should be standing at the center of the Christian vision for politics is not progress or social justice, not freedom, not diversity, not national security, but the person of Jesus Christ who is sovereign over all. And if we really take seriously who this Christ is and don't turn him into a small little personal savior, but recognize him as creator of all and as Lord of all, then what we will begin to realize is that all of these are dimensions of his creation and the way he has created the world. And then, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if I can show this to you, maybe you can see my marker there. He says that all of us will approach politics from somewhere. There might be some of us who find ourselves more drawn to this vision and will come at politics from this division. Others from this side of things. Others from this side of things. Apparently, 80% of the evangelical population seem to come at it from here, and the other 20%, equally vocal, are coming at it from here. But the point is that what we need to do is say, look, if you're over here, diversity is an important aspect, but it's not the whole. We got to acknowledge that there are insights over here. And what we've got to have is turn this into a table, so to speak, a table that we sit and discuss, but if I'm over here, I better be critical of my own political ideology and my own political party. If I'm over here, I better be critical. I better listen to my brothers and sisters who have insight from the standpoint of the gospel to these various areas. And so what I need to do is what we need to do, and this is what they're stressing in Phoenix, and I really think it's exactly the thing we need to do, is the fact that in our churches, we're going to have Black and white and Hispanic Christians, poor and rich Christians. We're going to have them from various spectrums. And what we need to do is hang on to each other in Christ and discuss what a healthy, publicly just society looks like from the standpoint of the insight that each of them have, and quite frankly, the insights that all of them do not have. In other words, the fact that there is much in public justice missing from all of these parties. So if we wanted to say I drew something on the whiteboard like this once, and I said, if public justice is this wide, in fact, all the parties in the United States have narrowed public justice to this much, and then they're only disagreeing, and their spectrum is within this small spectrum. So we need to also discuss the many dimensions of public justice that are missing from these particular ideologies. So let me conclude, and then we'll have some time for questions. I wanted to cover quickly. I apologize for sketching it so quickly, and in some ways way too simply. But
can you go back to that last slide? One other point I want to make, especially as a pastor, this is a really convicting thing. And it's this idea, as you look at this, if I were to say to a pastor, you were to say to me, hey, maybe a quarter of your church is in danger, like they're on their way to becoming Muslim, converting to Islam. Another quarter is in danger of converting to Judaism. Another quarter to Mormonism, another quarter to Hindu, whatever it is. When you think about religions in that sense, and it frames it differently, I'd be really panicked. And I would start intentionally like, oh, I need to do an apologetic about these different religions that people are going towards. If you see each of these are all good aspects of God's creation, like you said. So starting with creation, there's good aspects. One of the things we do when we draw this out for people is ask people, where do you see freedom and responsibility in the garden? Like in Genesis 1 and 2, where do you see these four different things? There's these four. Security is there in the garden. They were secure, all these things. But they're good parts of God's creation that get drawn out and become ultimate things. And these become, and this is where it really hits home, where you're like, wow, without even thinking about it, there are massive amounts of people in our churches who but have already converted fundamentally at their core. They're actually worshiping these other ideologies, these things. And so it draws another, like why this is so very important.
That's right. And one of the things that David Koyzis says that I appreciate, he says that the idea of reducing a political vision to one aspect of the political task is a view held by many people, Christians and non. He says, but one of the things that makes a Christian understanding of ideologies distinctively Christian is the two things I mentioned. Number one, that they are idolatrous. And as soon as you start talking about idolatry in the Bible, you're talking about a demonic presence that controls idolatry. That's very clear, for example, in Corinthians and Colossians, that idolatry is not just having a bad view of things, a reductionist view of things. There's a demonic element that enters into all idolatry. So you're right. This is not just a reductionist vision. There is idolatry and religious vision at work. But the second thing that makes it distinctively Christian is that there is a redemptive story. In other words, if we follow this path, we will be able to build a better world. It's really a false messiah. Bob Goudswaard, who is one of my favorite authors about anything, but he talks about economic ideologies. He says economic ideologies really substitute a new story of creation, fall, and redemption for the biblical story. And when you put it that way, my goodness, that is suggesting a really strong religious vision. And so I think you're right that a lot of, I don't want to be accusatory here, but I think a lot of Christians have really taken over the humanist worldview as they've taken over a political ideology and have departed from the Christian faith, at least in that particular area. And so it needs to be stressed, the religious dimension of these things. So I'm 100% with you, Chris, and it's a good thing to stress. So final comments, and then we'll just see what you have to talk about. First, not just one ideology at work in any one party. For example, what I've come to see as it's taken me a while in trying to understand the political scene, because the idols of Canada are very different than the idols of the United States. The dangers are very different. But I've started to see how for Trump, at least these four ideologies are at work together: nationalism, racism, an older liberalism, and liberalism is the new conservatism. Are you okay with that? In other words, liberalism of the 19th century became the right wing conservatism. So the most consistent liberal in the 20th century has been Ronald Reagan. So an older liberalism and national security. And there's probably more. And these are all woven together. And I think we can see where the various dimensions come from and why they're at work together. And so there's no room for offering ultimate loyalty to any political ideology. As I look at the choices you have in the United States for this coming election, it makes me kind of tremble to whatever vision takes hold. And there's no room for any ultimate loyalty to any political ideology. The only loyalty that we should have is to Christ and to witness, to the coming kingdom of God. And our first family are those who profess the person of Jesus Christ, and not those who are, say, Republicans or Democrats. And there's room for strategic differences. To say, I'm voting for this, for the Republican Party because I think strategically it's important who's put into the Supreme Court. Or I'm voting against Trump because I see him as one of the most dangerous people that we've ever had, regardless of party. Or however you want to come at this, because I've heard both of those things said. But there's room for strategic differences and approaches, but recognizing that these are only strategic differences, approaches, and that our concern should be with the gospel. And as we live in this country, to make our humanistic culture more just, more humane, more fair, more compassionate, in other words, have a salting impact in our world without any ultimate commitment to any humanist vision. But I think it's important to say all are reductionistic, all are idolatrous, and all are therefore inherently unjust. And I've lost this one point, but the last point that I want to make is that all of them will make contributions to political life. And finally, this last point, I think for some reason I've lost this, that none are going to make the USA a Christian nation. None of them are going to make, we could have a discussion of what that even means, but none will make the USA a Christian nation. All of them will have a small role in administering public justice. And I think part of our problem is that we have, and this is in Western culture in general, we put too much confidence in government to be able to bring about certain changes and do certain things. The word for that, if you want to talk, is statism. We've believed that the government can have a much bigger role than it actually can. And we need to recognize, I mean, I look at the early church and I think in the book of Revelation, 1 Peter, they didn't have a lot of confidence the government was going to do a whole lot. And their concern was to bear witness to Jesus Christ in their particular context. And if they were to have a political witness, so be it, and that's wonderful. But their ultimate commitment was to Christ. And I think we bought into the nationalism and the statism of Western culture, and we could point where that comes from historically, but we bought into that too much, and we have far too much confidence in our government to be able to bring about the kingdom of God, when in fact, it cannot do anything of the sort. Okay, so I've thrown enough out there now, and we have about 20 minutes for discussion. Sorry for the quick sketch, for saying so much in so little time.
Mike, if you're going to be a pastor and talk about this stuff, or just be a follower of Jesus and start talking about politics, you're going to hear before long from other Christians, especially, hey, why are we talking about politics? Let's get back to the gospel. Can we just focus on the gospel? I'd love to hear you just kind of riff on that. Like, how do you think about that? How do you respond to that? And for us to, just to hear how you're thinking about that, because we're going to get asked that question.
That's a huge question, Chris. First, I think that question comes because the gospel has been reduced. It's been reduced in at least three ways. It's been reduced to the individual salvation. It's been reduced in an otherworldly way, that is reduced to the individuals going to heaven. And it's been reduced, there's several other ways too that are coming to mind, but it's been reduced to the future. In other words, it's individuals going to heaven in the future. In other words, right now, if we're forgiven and we're justified so we can go to heaven in the future as individuals, that's the gospel. And that is a reductionist gospel. Anybody that wants to take the time to ask what the gospel is and start with Jesus, his gospel is the gospel of the kingdom. That is good news. The kingdom of God has come. That is, God is restoring his rule over the entirety of creation, the entirety of human life. And the good news is about the healing of the entire creation. So that means the gospel will speak to every dimension of life, because God is restoring to every aspect, and we're called to bear witness to that. In our various, so that's the first thing I would say, that it's a reductionist view of the gospel. But the second thing I would say is that most people in the world, and believe me when I say this, because I've had questions, would scratch their heads at that kind of comment, not because of the reductionist gospel, but because they say, well, it's pretty clear that Jesus didn't believe that, and pretty clear that the prophets didn't believe that. It's pretty clear that the law didn't believe, and they kind of don't understand why. And the problem is because of American history, and often a dynamic we don't know about, that through the 20th century, there's been a battle beginning in the early 20th century between the social gospel and the revivalist views. And the revivalist views had the most consistent reductionist gospel, but the social gospel had a very secularized gospel. And these two faced off and were seen as the only options. And that has impacted the entirety of American life. Right up, I'm hearing that the newer generations, maybe the first generation that hasn't been to some degree influenced by this, but that this dynamic has been part of the church now for 100 years in the United States, and it's not affected. Like growing up in the Canadian church, this was not the dynamic that I understood. I didn't understand until later as a Christian. I went to the United States and I kind of scratched my head and say, what's this division? And I actually did a doctoral paper on that to realize that this whole dynamic, this whole history has shaped our thinking. So the gospel is about God's renewal of all of life. And to reduce it to a secular gospel, like the social gospel, or an individualist, future, otherworldly gospel, like the revivalists, would be, I think, a big mistake.
Mm-hmm. Mike, there's a question here from Andrew who says, can Mike say something about the Canadian multicultural context? And now I'm assuming that the majority of people on this call are American here in the United States. And so, but I think that question is really important. I'd love to hear you talk about that, because it's really helpful for, I think, us as Americans to realize, oh, there's actually something going on outside of the United States. And there's other, and so even to kind of hear, how do you think about your context there in Canada can help us relativize what's happening here in the States?
Yeah. I mean, there's some ways that the conflicts in the United States are so much more minor and they're much softer, but the danger in some ways is just as big, if not bigger. You know, we serve the gods of tolerance. We serve the gods of multiculturalism. And what has happened is underlying that is a deep relativism and a deep political correctness. We have made diversity down on the bottom left of the political ideologies. And, we don't fight about it anymore because we all agree diversity is the political ideology that will move us forward. And so I've heard a prime minister basically speak of the three aspects of Canadian political life that we all agree on. And basically I saw this is the Trinitarian God that Canadians worship. And that is basically multiculturalism, tolerance, and diversity. Multiculturalism, tolerance, and diversity. And so basically, the danger of the Canadian church is to simply capitulate to that, because diversity and tolerance and multiculturalism, that comes from the gospel. But when it's made an ideology, when it's made an idolatry, it's very dangerous. And I see a church that in many ways is capitulating to the relativism that underlies that. And therefore, I think that the danger is sometimes greater when there's no conflict. You might not believe that, but when there's no conflict, it's much easier simply for the whole church, liberal and conservative, to fall into that ideology from different standpoints. But I think I would want to say one more thing. The Canadian church, like everywhere else in the world, is being affected by American politics. I mean, America is a global power, and it's affecting everybody. I spend a lot of time in Brazil. I spend a lot of time in Chile and in Hungary. And believe it or not, they take different stances toward the United States, but they're deeply affected by it. So are we. For example, we had very little in the way of racism towards African Americans or African Canadians, blacks, in Canada for the longest time. In the last few years, we've seen more and more of that. Our racism has often been towards the native peoples, Aboriginal people, but not towards blacks. But now it's interesting that in the last 4 years with the Trump administration, there's been more incidences of that than ever before, and it's becoming a real problem. So we're affected by American politics. So if you went to various places in Canada, you'd find an anti-American anger, and you'd also find an adoption of American views as well. So.
All right, we got like 10 minutes. There are a bunch of questions here. Want to do rapid fire, but there's one that you're not going to be able to rapid fire, but I think this is so important. I want you to read and answer this. So Tommy, you'll be excited for this. Tommy, this past Sunday, I mentioned New Begin's quote that the Marxist or socialist ideology is in fact capitalism's evil twin sister, yes, indicating that both have the same parents from the Enlightenment. Yes. Could you comment more on the Enlightenment parents New Begin spent so much time calling out?
Oh boy, that's what actually I wanted to do originally. Basically the Enlightenment vision that we were progressing towards a better world through science, technology, and getting the right economic and political system, that's held all of Western culture. But then that progress story was challenged in the late 19th century by tremendous suffering and pain. Think here of Dickens and what begins to happen in England. And so how do you hold on to your faith in progress? Well, the Marxists say you hold on to your faith in progress through revolution. That pain is going to cause people to rise up and to challenge those in power, and through revolution, we will progress. The liberals basically said the way to do it is continue to be free, to embrace a social Darwinism, that there will be casualties on the way. It's a matter of survival of the fittest. So embrace freedom, an economic freedom that has built the Industrial Revolution, and let it keep going, and we will build a better world. So we'll progress through evolution. So progress through revolution or progress through evolution. And these two visions were then captured, the first world and the second world. The evolution captured the American and the European vision. The revolution captured the Soviet Union. But both shared the Enlightenment story, but both had different visions of what the government and the economic system should look like to get us to this better world and to allow us to continue to progress. So I've been in countries of the former Soviet Union. And I remember 15 years ago in the Ukraine showing a diagram of humanism, and somebody basically said, that's exactly what we believe here in the Soviet Union. The only thing we disagree on is what economic and what political system will get us there. So I think he's exactly right that these, and I think in my book, Living at the Crossroads, I make just this point, and how they basically share the humanist worldview, but basically have a different vision for how we're going to get to this better, how human beings are going to build the better world through science and technology and politics and economics and education.
From Doxa, are all dimensions of political justice equally important, or should some be weighted as more urgent and important?
That's where the Christian dialogue needs to take place. I'd say they're all, if you want to talk creationally, equally important. They all need to find their place. But the point is what is most urgent at the moment? What is most urgent in our day? What are the things that are being suppressed in our day? And what are the problem? What are the issues that have to be addressed contextually? So I'd say that we need to generally. I mean, what's very interesting is that in this divide between the left and the right, if you look back at the early 20th century, the majority of countries in the world, in Europe, Canada, Australia, and so forth, they believed the left was more Christian because concern for the poor should be a stronger concern than ideological freedom. The United States was the only one to take the right wing, and so there was so most Christians in other parts of the world found that strange. They said, surely concern for the poor should trump economic freedom. But the question is what is most urgent in our particular day, in our particular moment? And so I think we need to think strategically. I just remember my dad voting way on the left, way on the right, sometimes in the middle, because he was basically asking the question, who's the best candidate? What are the issues of the day? I think that's what we desperately need instead of being loyal to any particular party.
How do you advise having discussions over ideologies? How can we help people see that there is a current humanistic bent towards politics and faith?
Yeah, this is part of a much, much bigger question, and that is how in the world can we help our churches and ourselves understand the story we're living in? And I wish I could give you a shortcut, but there is none. It's a long product of discipleship, and I believe it's an urgent one. That's why at MTC, one of the ways we depart from traditional theological education is that we spend a lot of time telling the Western story, analyzing the Western story, trying to understand the Western story so that the gospel doesn't become accommodated to the idols of that Western story. And so the problem is, of course, that number one, we're like fish in water. If you don't want to know about water, don't ask a fish. You want to know about the United States, don't ask an American because they're swimming in it. You want to know about Canada, don't ask a Canadian, we're swimming in it. But furthermore, we believe that our particular nations are Christian, or used to be, or at least at very worst neutral. We don't recognize the danger of religion. And so therefore, we're right off the bat not equipped to even think of our culture in religious terms. And I think it is only going to be a very long process of discipleship. And I think this is what all leaders have to think. They can't think about the quick fix.
Yeah.
They have to think of a long road of discipleship for the rest of their lives, thinking like the monks did into the second and the third generation, and trying to just take the steps needed in that first generation so the next church in the second generation can take it. And I think that one of the things that I stress in every part of the world that I speak is that that leaders have to take the importance of discipleship, coming to know the biblical story, coming to know the story and the idols of their culture extremely seriously if the church is to be able to bear faithful witness to the kingdom of God. So I wish I could give you a nice, easy way of doing it, but there is none. I think it's you, if you're a leader, have to get to know that story well yourself. Then it has to become part of your preaching, part of your discipleship, and so on. And maybe that's one more thing I could say about preaching. So much preaching is abstract and does not encounter the idols of our culture. And yet every book of the Bible, I would say every book of the Bible encounters the idolatry of their day and their age and their time. And so it should be almost impossible for us to preach the Bible and not encountering the idolatry of our own.
One thing I just say, this is like a drawing I'll try to explain, that not just for this, for politics, but for this is kind of, and how to encounter this and how to help people see this. It's a drawing I just have in my head that I try to either draw out for people or get people to think. We just take a sheet of paper and draw a line down the middle. So kind of just showing two different stories. And on the one side, on the left side, I'll draw a line through the middle of that. And Mike, you've just kind of talked about upstairs, downstairs, that in Platonic dualism, there's kind of upstairs, there's values, and that's where religion is, and that's where kind of faith and some of these things are up here. And then politics and science and like the real stuff that matters here in life is downstairs. And that these two are separate things, and there's a solid line between the two. I think that's the assumption that I even find myself after a dozen years of you saying the same stuff, it's like I naturally go back to that. I'm still a fish swimming in this water, and I see that in different ways all the time, that there's this dualism, Platonic dualism between the two, upstairs and downstairs. But then on the other side, to draw out in your drama of scripture, you talk about the Bible as a 6-act play. And so we have these 6 symbols we use that draw that on the other side, where you have these 6 symbols for creation, rebellion, the promise, the story of Israel, Christ's redemptive work, the church, and then the final restoration, new creation of all things. And so put that, and then just to put some people underneath the church, and realizing this is where we're at. We're in the midst of what God is doing in history and how he's rescuing and saving history. And we're a missional people that find ourselves in the midst of this. And so always to try to draw that back, that I'm assuming when I'm talking to people that they're thinking in this one way, and I'm trying to draw them over to this. And all of the discipleship of the church, all that we're trying to do is trying to increasingly help people see this, but not just see this, but then see that how do we take up our role faithfully in the midst of this story? Mike, we're just about out. So is there anything last thing you'd want to leave us with?
I probably
for mostly Americans who are headed into an election season.
Yeah. I pray for your faithfulness during this time and trying to lead a congregation. I'm struck by something that Newbegin said about church leadership. He said that often we run our leadership through the lens of Ephesians 4. That is, we're equipping those. And he says that's a good lens. He says, but far more often, he says, I think we need to run our leadership through the lens of 2 Corinthians. He says, whereas we struggle with the church to be faithful, we are going to suffer as leaders. And we're going to suffer not just from those outside, we're going to suffer from believers inside who are caught up in those ideologies and that idolatry. And 2 Corinthians shows Paul struggling with the church and suffering because of the idols of the Corinthian culture. And I think that a faithful leadership is going to suffer during this political time as they challenge ideologies, because ideologies are not just reductionism, there's a demonic element. And we're committed to those things, and those kind of things will take hold of our hearts, and there will be push back. And that's why we saw what we did in 2016. I saw it in Phoenix, but why we saw it all over the nation. And so I'd say be faithful. The gospel has power, and be willing to suffer during this time. Be willing to suffer by challenging the right and the left. And sometimes you're going to say, man, oh man, am I crazy? And the answer is no. Not if you're hanging in there with the gospel. Be willing to challenge the right and the left. Be willing to suffer.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the encouragement, Mike. Thanks for all the teaching. We really appreciate it. This has really been helpful. I didn't get to answer or ask or answer a number of questions. So if you have those, either email me. If you don't have my email, email Saturate, and they'll forward the questions onto me. And I'll interact with Mike. Several looking for resources on some different things. And so, yeah. So thanks everybody for being a part of this, and check out the next one.